The thundering hooves of a lone chestnut stallion kicked up dust across the barren landscape of Arizona Territory, 1875. Rider and horse moved as one entity, their silhouette carved against the blood-orange sunset that painted the vast desert in shades of amber and gold. Rhett Turner had been riding this way for nearly 7 years alone, silent, with only the whisper of the wind and occasional howl of coyotes to keep him company. The leather of his saddle creaked with each rhythmic movement, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. At 34, Rhett had seen more of the brutal West than most men twice his age. The war had changed him, like it had changed so many others. But unlike those who found their way back to civilization, Rhett had chosen solitude. His weathered face, bronzed from years under the merciless sun, rarely broke into anything resembling a smile. The deep lines around his eyes weren't from laughter, but from squinting across endless horizons, searching for something he couldn't name. As he crested a small ridge, something unusual caught his eye in the valley below. A covered wagon sat at an awkward angle, one wheel clearly broken, its white canvas top fluttering in the evening breeze like a wounded bird trying to take flight. But it wasn't the wagon that made Rhett pull back on his reins. It was the figure beside it, a woman, sitting on an overturned crate, her head in her hands. Something inside him hesitated. He'd avoided human contact for so long that the thought of engaging with a stranger made his chest tighten. He could simply ride around, pretend he hadn't seen her. There were plenty of paths through these hills that would take him wide of her trouble. "Come on, Maverick," he muttered to his horse, intending to steer him away. But the animal snorted and stomped, as if disagreeing with his master's instinct. Rhett sighed, adjusting his worn hat. "Fine. We'll check, but we're not staying." He guided Maverick down the gentle slope, approaching slowly so as not to startle the woman. As he drew closer, he could see she was younger than he first thought, perhaps in her mid-20s. Her dark blonde hair was falling loose from what had once been a neat arrangement, and her dress, though dusty and travel-worn, was of good quality. She looked up at the sound of his approach, quickly wiping at her eyes. Rhett noticed they were a striking shade of green, even red-rimmed as they were from crying. She straightened her posture, one hand instinctively reaching for something beside her, a rifle, he realized. A woman alone in the territory needed protection, and he respected her caution. "Madam," he called out, keeping his hands visible as he brought Maverick to a stop about 20 feet from her. "Looks like you've had some trouble." The woman's gaze was wary but direct. "That's one way to put it, sir," she replied, her voice steadier than he expected. "My wheel's broken, my mule's run off, and I've spent the last hour debating whether to start walking to Colombia or wait for either rescue or death to find me first." Despite himself, Rhett felt the corner of his mouth twitch. She had spirit. "Colombia's a far piece to walk, especially with night coming on," he said, dismounting slowly. "I'm Rhett Turner." She hesitated before answering, her hand still near the rifle. "Eliza Miller. I was heading to my brother's homestead outside of Colombia. He's expecting me 4 days from now, so he won't come looking until well after I've either died of thirst or been carried off by coyotes." There was a hint of dark humor in her voice that surprised him. Most women would be hysterical in her situation. Rhett glanced at the wagon. "What happened to your wheel?" Eliza sighed. "Hit a rock the size of Texas hiding in a rut. The whole wheel just splintered. Then my mule got spooked by a rattler and took off with his harness half torn." She gestured to the broken pieces. "I tried to fix it, but not much you could do without proper tools or a spare wheel," Rhett finished for her. He moved closer to examine the damage, keeping his movements deliberate so as not to alarm her. The wheel was beyond repair. Its spokes shattered and the rim cracked in multiple places. He glanced inside the wagon and saw it was loaded with trunks, some furniture, and various supplies a woman's entire life, packed up and heading west. "You traveling alone, Miss Miller?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. "Mrs.," she corrected. "And yes, my husband died last winter in St. Louis, pneumonia." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Rhett caught the subtle tightening of her grip on her skirt. "My brother's the only family I have left." Rhett nodded, understanding settling over him like a familiar blanket. Loss was something he knew intimately. "Well, Mrs. Miller, you've got three options as I see it," he said, stepping back from the wagon. "You can wait here and hope someone else comes along, though this isn't a well-traveled trail. You can try to walk to Colombia, which I wouldn't recommend." Or he paused, surprised at what he was about to offer. "I can help you get there." Eliza studied him, her green eyes searching his face. "And why would you do that, Mr. Turner? You don't know me." It was a fair question. Rhett wasn't sure of the answer himself. For years, he'd avoided entanglements of any kind. His solitary existence was a choice, a shield against the pain that came with caring. "Because leaving a woman alone out here isn't something I could live with," he finally said. "And it looks like you could use some help." A flicker of something relief, gratitude, or perhaps simple exhaustion crossed her face. "I can pay you," she offered. Rhett shook his head. "That's not necessary." "I insist," Eliza said firmly. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Turner, not even when I need help." He recognized the pride in her stance, the same stubborn dignity he carried himself. "We can discuss that later," he conceded, looking at the darkening sky. "Right now, we need to make camp before we lose the light. Tomorrow we can figure out how to get your belongings to Colombia." For a moment, Rhett thought she might refuse. But then her shoulders relaxed slightly and she nodded. "Thank you." He set about making a fire while Eliza gathered what she needed from her wagon. The routine of camping was familiar to him, collecting dry brush for kindling, arranging stones in a circle, striking flint to spark the flames. What wasn't familiar was doing these tasks with someone else nearby. The soft sounds of another person moving about, breathing, existing in his space. As the fire grew stronger, casting a warm glow over their makeshift camp, Rhett found himself watching Eliza as she carefully unpacked some food supplies. There was a quiet efficiency to her movements, a practiced ease that told him she was no stranger to hardship. "I have some coffee and jerky to share," she offered, settling on a blanket she'd spread near the fire. "That's kind, but I've got my own supplies," Rhett replied, pulling dried meat and a battered tin cup from his saddlebag. They ate in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and occasional whinny from Maverick, the only sounds breaking the desert quiet. The stars emerged one by one, brilliant against the darkening canvas of the sky. Rhett found himself wondering what series of events had led this woman to travel alone across such dangerous country. Widowhood explained part of it, but there was a determination in her that spoke of deeper motivations. "Your brother," he said finally, breaking the silence. "What's his name?" Eliza looked up, surprised by the question. Samuel Miller. He came west about 5 years ago after the war, worked as a carpenter, saved enough to buy land outside Colombia. He writes that he's built a proper house now, with glass windows and everything." There was pride in her voice and something like longing. "And he's expecting you to live with him," she nodded. "For a while at least, until I—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Until I decide what comes next." Rhett understood. The war had left many people adrift, searching for new beginnings. He'd been searching himself, though he wasn't sure he'd admit it. "Colombia's growing fast," he said. "Lot of opportunities there." "That's what Sam says. There's even talk of a school needing teachers." A small smile touched her lips. "I taught before I was married." The conversation lapsed into silence again, but it was less tense now. As the night deepened, Eliza arranged her bedroll on one side of the fire, while Rhett took the opposite side, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm a light sleeper, Mrs. Miller," he said as he settled onto his blanket. "If anything approaches, I'll wake." She nodded, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Turner, for stopping. Not everyone would have." Rhett tipped his hat slightly in acknowledgement, then lay back, his rifle within easy reach. As he stared up at the stars, he found himself strangely aware of the woman's presence across the fire. It had been so long since he'd shared a camp with anyone, longer still since that anyone had been a woman. It made him uneasy, but not in an entirely unpleasant way. Morning arrived with the harsh brilliance of the desert dawn. Rhett woke first, as was his habit, and had coffee brewing by the time Eliza stirred. She emerged from her blankets looking remarkably composed for someone who had spent the night on hard ground, smoothing her hair and straightening her dress with practiced motions. "Good morning, Mr. Turner," she said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "Mrs. Miller." He nodded, already assessing their situation in the daylight. "I've been thinking about your wagon. The axle's intact and the body is sound. We might be able to fashion a travois of sorts, attach it to Maverick. He's strong enough to pull a good portion of your belongings." Eliza considered this. "That would leave a lot behind." "We'd come back for the rest," Rhett suggested, surprising himself with the offer. "Take what you need most to Colombia, then return for the heavier items." She studied him over her coffee cup, her green eyes thoughtful. "You do that." Rhett wasn't sure why, but he nodded. "I would." They spent the morning disassembling what they could of the wagon, salvaging the wooden planks and canvas. Rhett worked with the efficiency of a man accustomed to solving problems alone, but he found Eliza to be a capable partner. She anticipated his needs, handed him tools before he asked, and offered practical suggestions that showed a keen mind. By midday, they had constructed a makeshift travois and loaded it with her most essential belongings: clothes, personal items, a small trunk that she insisted contained irreplaceable memories, and enough supplies to sustain them. "Colombia's 3 days' ride from here," Rhett said as he secured the last rope. "We'll need to travel light and slow, given what Maverick's pulling." Eliza looked at the remaining items they would have to leave behind: a rocking chair, a small writing desk, some kitchen supplies. "Will they be safe?" "I'll cover them with the canvas, secure it well," he promised. "Not many travelers come this way, and most are honest folk just trying to get by." She nodded, accepting his assessment. "I appreciate this, Mr. Turner, truly." Something in her sincere gratitude made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being thanked, wasn't used to helping anyone but himself. "Let's get moving," he said gruffly. "We'll want to make good distance before sunset." The journey began with Rhett walking beside Maverick, leading him carefully over the rough terrain, while Eliza walked on the horse's other side. The travois dragged behind them, bouncing occasionally on rocks but holding together as they'd hoped. After an hour of walking in silence, Rhett noticed Eliza's pace beginning to flag. The sun was merciless, and despite the hat she wore, her face was flushed with heat. "Ride for a while," he said, stopping Maverick. She shook her head. "I'm fine, Mr. Turner." "You're not," he countered. "And we'll make better time if you don't collapse from heat stroke." Eliza looked ready to argue but seemed to think better of it. With his help, she mounted Maverick, sitting side saddle as her dress required. The horse adjusted to the new weight, and they continued their journey, Rhett leading them through the scrubland toward the distant promise of Colombia. As they traveled, Rhett found himself increasingly curious about his companion. She was unlike most women he'd encountered, self-possessed, resilient, with a quiet strength that reminded him of the frontier women he'd known in his youth. Women who didn't complain about hardship because complaining changed nothing. "How long were you married, Mrs. Miller?" he asked as they stopped to water Maverick at a small stream. Eliza looked surprised at the personal question. 4 years, she answered after a moment. Edward and I married just after the war ended. Was he a soldier? She shook her head. A doctor. He treated soldiers, though. That's how we met. I was volunteering at the hospital in St. Louis. A soft smile touched her lips at the memory. He was kind, gentle. Even after seeing all the horrors of war injuries, he never lost his compassion. Rhett nodded, understanding the rare quality she described. The war had hardened most men, turned them bitter or cruel. To maintain kindness through that hell was remarkable. "And you, Mr. Turner?" Eliza asked as they resumed walking. "Were you in the war?" "I was." His answer was clipped, uninviting of further questions. But Eliza was either brave or unaware of his reluctance. "Which side?" Rhett gave her a measured look. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not," she conceded. "Not anymore." They walked in silence for a while, the rhythmic creak of the travois and Maverick's occasional snort the only sounds between them. "Union," he finally said. "8th Illinois Cavalry." Eliza nodded. Edward treated men from both sides, said their blood ran the same color. "Your husband sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." She adjusted her position on Maverick's back. "May I ask what you've been doing since the war, Mr. Turner?" Rhett considered deflecting the question but found himself answering honestly. "Drifting, mostly. Did some cattle driving in Texas. Tried my hand at prospecting in California. Scouted for the Army for a while." He paused. "Nothing that stuck. And now," he shrugged, "now I ride, keep to myself." "That sounds lonely," Eliza observed, her voice gentle rather than judgmental. Rhett didn't respond immediately. Lonely wasn't a word he used to describe his life. Solitary, yes, independent, free. But lonely suggested a lack, a hunger for something missing. He'd never allowed himself to feel that hunger, had deliberately numbed himself to it years ago. "It's simpler," he finally said. "Less complicated." Eliza seemed to consider this. "I can understand the appeal of simplicity," she said. "After Edward died, there were days when I could barely face the complexity of deciding what to eat for breakfast, let alone what to do with the rest of my life." Her frank admission caught him off guard. It was rare to hear someone speak so honestly about grief. "What made you decide to come west?" he asked. "Sam's letters, partly. He wrote about the open skies, the sense of possibility here." She looked around at the vast landscape surrounding them. "But also, I couldn't stay in St. Louis. Too many memories in every corner. I needed something new, something entirely different." Rhett nodded. He understood that impulse better than most. By late afternoon, they had covered a decent distance, but the heat had taken its toll on all of them. When they came upon a small copse of cottonwoods near a spring, Rhett decided they would make camp. "We'll rest here for the night," he announced, helping Eliza down from Maverick. "There's water and shade." She didn't argue, which told him how tired she truly was. While he unsaddled Maverick and set up their camp, Eliza took stock of their supplies and began preparing a simple meal from her provisions. As the sun began to set, they sat together near a small fire, eating beans and hardtack softened in coffee. The silence between them was comfortable now, the kind that develops between travelers who have shared a day's journey. "You never mentioned what you were doing in these parts," Eliza said suddenly. "Before you found me, I mean." Rhett looked up from his plate. "Just passing through," he said. "I heard there might be work in Colombia. Thought I'd see for myself." It wasn't entirely true. He'd been drifting without destination, as he had for years. Colombia was just another town on an endless road. Eliza studied him, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she saw through his vague explanation. "What kind of work do you do when you're not rescuing stranded widows?" The question brought an unexpected smile to his lips. "Whatever pays," he said. "I'm handy with horses, decent with a gun if someone needs protection, can build most things that need building." "A man of many talents," she observed. "Jack of all trades, master of none," he countered. Eliza shook her head. "I don't believe that. You strike me as someone who does things thoroughly or not at all." Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Rhett shifted, changing the subject. "Your brother, is he married?" "Got family in Colombia, not married," Eliza replied. "Though in his letters, he's mentioned a young lady who runs the general store. I suspect there might be some interest there." She smiled slightly. "Sam was always shy around women. Takes him forever to work up the courage to speak his mind. And he's expecting you to live with him." She nodded. "He's built a room for me in his house. Says I can stay as long as I want." Her expression grew more serious. "Though I don't intend to be a burden, I hope to find work in town, contribute my share." "A school teacher, you mentioned." "Yes, though I'd take whatever work is available. I'm not afraid of hard work." Rhett believed her. Everything about Eliza Miller spoke of resilience and determination. He'd seen how she handled the disaster of her broken wagon, how she'd walked for hours today without complaint despite the heat and dust. "Colombia's growing fast," he said. "New businesses opening all the time. I imagine they'll need teachers soon enough with all the families settling there." Eliza's eyes brightened at this. "I hope so. I miss teaching. There's something special about watching a child grasp a new idea, seeing that moment of understanding dawn in their eyes." Her enthusiasm was genuine, her face animated in a way he hadn't seen before. It transformed her features, making her even more attractive than he'd first noticed. The realization that he found her attractive caught Rhett off guard. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to notice such things about a woman. He stood abruptly. "We should get some sleep. Long day tomorrow." If Eliza was surprised by his sudden shift, she didn't show it. She nodded, beginning to clear up their simple meal. "Of course. Thank you again for your help today, Mr. Turner." "Rhett," he said, surprising himself. "You might as well call me Rhett if we're traveling together." She looked up, a small smile playing at her lips. "Then I'm Eliza." He nodded once, then turned to check on Maverick, needing a moment away from her perceptive gaze. As he brushed the horse's coat and checked his hooves, Rhett tried to understand his own reactions. He'd spent years keeping people at arm's length, avoiding connections that might lead to pain. Yet here he was, offering his first name to a woman he barely knew, feeling drawn to her in a way that made him both curious and wary. When he returned to the fire, Eliza had already settled onto her blanket, her back to him as she gazed out at the desert night. Rhett took his place on the opposite side, staring up at the stars and listening to the subtle sounds of her breathing across the dying embers. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his solitude not as the freedom he'd convinced himself it was, but as the burden it had truly become. The second day of their journey proved more challenging than the first. The terrain grew rockier as they moved toward the foothills that surrounded Colombia, and the makeshift travois required constant adjustment. By midday, the heat was oppressive, the sun beating down without mercy from a cloudless sky. Rhett noticed Eliza was struggling, though she tried to hide it. Her steps had become less steady, and despite drinking regularly from her canteen, her lips were dry and cracked. "We need to find shade," he decided, scanning the horizon. "Rest through the worst of the heat." Eliza didn't object, which worried him more than if she had argued. About a half-mile ahead, he spotted a formation of rocks that might provide some shelter. Leading Maverick carefully over the uneven ground, they made their way toward it. The rocks formed a natural alcove, deep enough to shield them from the sun and provide a cool spot for rest. Rhett helped Eliza sit in the deepest part of the shade, then unpacked their water and some dried fruit. "Eat," he encouraged, placing the food beside her, "and drink more. The desert takes moisture from you before you realize it's gone." She nodded, taking small sips from her canteen. "I'm sorry to slow us down." "You're not," he assured her. "It's foolish to push through midday heat. We'll make better time in the evening and early morning." As they rested, Rhett found himself studying Eliza's profile. Despite the strain of travel, there was a quiet dignity to her posture, a gentle strength in the set of her jaw. Her hands, he noticed, were not those of a pampered city woman. They showed signs of work, though they were still decidedly feminine. "Tell me about your teaching," he said, hoping conversation would distract her from the discomfort of the heat. "What subjects did you teach?" Eliza looked surprised by his interest, but seemed glad for the distraction. "Everything, really. In the school where I taught, one teacher handled all subjects for children of various ages." A fond smile touched her lips. "Reading was my favorite to teach. Opening those doors to new worlds for children. There's nothing like it. You sound passionate about it." "I am. Education changes lives." She took another sip of water. "What about you, Rhett? What are you passionate about?" The question caught him off guard. Passion wasn't something he'd thought about in years. Once, he'd been passionate about many things: justice, freedom, building a future. The war had burned much of that out of him, leaving ashes where fires had once raged. "Been a while since I thought in those terms," he admitted. "There must be something," Eliza pressed gently. "Something that makes you feel alive." Rhett considered this. "The open country, I suppose," he finally said. "Riding where few others go, seeing what's over the next ridge." He paused, surprising himself with his honesty. "Freedom." Eliza nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That makes sense. You strike me as someone who values his independence. To a fault, some might say," he added wryly. "Is that why you've never settled anywhere, never put down roots?" The question was direct but not accusatory. Still, Rhett felt a defensiveness rise in him. "Roots can trap you," he said, "tie you down, make you vulnerable. They can also sustain you," Eliza countered softly, "give you strength when storms come." Their eyes met across the small space, and Rhett felt an unexpected connection, as if she understood something about him that most people missed. It was unsettling but not entirely unwelcome. After a moment, he looked away. "We should rest while we can. We'll move on when the sun starts to drop." Eliza didn't push further, simply nodding and leaning back against the cool rock. Soon, her breathing deepened, and Rhett realized she had fallen asleep, exhaustion finally overtaking her. He watched her for a moment, noting how vulnerable she looked in sleep. The careful composure she maintained while awake now softened. A strand of hair had fallen across her cheek, and he felt an unexpected urge to brush it away. Instead, he turned his attention to Maverick, checking that the horse had enough water and shade. As he adjusted the travois and inspected their supplies, Rhett found his thoughts continually drifting back to Eliza. Her question about passion had stirred something in him, awakened memories of a younger man who had believed in things, who had looked to the future with hope rather than wariness. By late afternoon, the heat had relented enough for them to continue. Eliza woke looking refreshed, and they set out again, Rhett insisting she ride Maverick while he walked alongside. "We should reach Colombia by tomorrow afternoon," he told her as they navigated a narrow path through the hills. "There's a small trading post about 2 hours ahead where we can spend the night. safer than camping in the open this close to town. Eliza looked surprised. You know this area well, Rhett nodded. Passed through a few times over the years. Have you ever stayed in Colombia before? Briefly, he admitted. About 2 years ago. It was smaller then but growing fast. Lot of opportunity for those looking to build something. But not for you, she asked perceptively. Rhett glanced up at her. Like I said, I don't usually stay anywhere long. What would it take? Eliza asked. For you to stay somewhere, I mean. The question was innocent enough, but it struck at something deep inside him. What would it take? He'd asked himself that same question countless times over the years, never finding an answer that satisfied. Don't rightly know, he said honestly. Something worth staying for, I suppose. Eliza didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. I hope you find it someday, she finally said. Everyone deserves a place to call home. Her words stayed with Rhett as they continued their journey. Home was a concept he'd abandoned years ago, convincing himself he didn't need or want such attachments. Yet hearing Eliza speak of it with such simple conviction made him wonder if he'd been running from more than just painful memories all these years. The trading post appeared on the horizon just as the sun was setting, a welcome sight after the long day's travel. It was a simple establishment, a log building with a small corral for horses and a few crude cabins for travelers. The proprietor, a grizzled old-timer named Jenkins, greeted them with minimal curiosity. Got one cabin left, he informed them after Rhett inquired about lodging. Not much, but it's got a roof and walls. Rhett glanced at Eliza, then back at Jenkins. The lady will take the cabin. I'll bed down in your barn if that's acceptable. Jenkins shrugged. Suit yourself. $1 for the cabin, 4 bits for the barn. Extra if you want hot water for washing. Eliza stepped forward. I'll pay for both our accommodations, Mr. Jenkins, she said firmly. And yes to the hot water, please. Before Rhett could object, she had opened her small purse and counted out the money. Jenkins pocketed it with a nod, then shuffled off to prepare their lodgings. You didn't need to do that, Rhett said once the proprietor was out of earshot. You've done far more for me, Eliza replied simply. Please allow me this small gesture in return. Something in her steady gaze made it difficult to refuse. Rhett nodded reluctantly, then set about seeing to Maverick and their belongings while Eliza went to inspect the cabin. After ensuring Maverick was comfortably stabled and fed, Rhett made his way to the trading post's small dining area. Jenkins's wife, a thin woman with kind eyes, served a basic but hearty stew with cornbread on the side. Eliza joined him shortly, looking refreshed after washing up with the hot water she'd requested. This is quite a luxury after 2 days on the trail, she commented as they ate. Real food and walls around us. Rhett smiled slightly. Simple pleasures. Sometimes those are the best kind, she replied, breaking off a piece of cornbread. My mother used to say that happiness isn't in grand things but in appreciating the small moments. Your mother sounds wise. She was. Eliza's expression grew wistful. She died when I was 16. Influenza. Rhett noted the familiar shadow of loss that crossed her features. I'm sorry. Seems you've had more than your share of grief. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Perhaps, but I've had joy too and hope. She looked up at him. Without hope, grief would be unbearable. Her resilience struck him anew. Many would have been broken by the losses she'd endured, yet here she was, traveling alone across dangerous territory to build a new life. What about your family, Rhett? She asked. Do you have people somewhere? He shook his head. Not anymore. Lost my parents before the war. No siblings. I'm sorry, she said softly. Rhett shrugged. It was a long time ago. They finished their meal in companionable silence, then stepped outside to the small porch of the trading post. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust on black velvet. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, their eerie howls echoing through the hills. "We'll reach Colombia tomorrow," Eliza said, her voice holding a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. "It's strange to think this journey is almost over." Rhett nodded, realizing with surprise that he felt a similar ambivalence. The prospect of delivering Eliza safely to her brother should have brought satisfaction, the completion of a good deed. Instead, he found himself strangely reluctant to see their time together end. "Will you stay in Colombia for a while?" Eliza asked, as if reading his thoughts. Rhett looked out at the darkened landscape. "Not sure yet. Depends on what work there is." She turned to face him, her expression earnest in the dim light from the trading post windows. "I hope you will. At least for a little while. I'd like to know you reached your next destination safely, wherever it might be." Her concern touched him in a way he hadn't expected. "I'll be fine, Eliza, always am." "I know you can take care of yourself," she said with a small smile. "But it's nice to have someone care where you end up all the same." Before he could respond, she continued. "Besides, I owe you a debt I can't easily repay. If you stayed, perhaps I could find a way to thank you properly for your help." "You don't owe me anything," Rhett insisted. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Eliza said firmly. "Not anyone. Many would have ridden past and left me to my fate." She held his gaze. "You're a good man, Rhett Turner, whether you believe it or not." Her words settled over him like a blanket, warm and unexpectedly comforting. It had been a long time since anyone had seen good in him, longer still since he'd seen it in himself. "It's getting late," he said, unable to find words to respond to her assessment. "You should rest. We've got an early start tomorrow." Eliza nodded, understanding his discomfort. "Good night, Rhett. Sleep well." As she turned to go to her cabin, Rhett found himself watching her retreating figure, struck by how much he'd come to admire her strength and dignity in the short time they'd known each other. "Eliza," he called softly, stopping her at the cabin door. When she looked back, he added, "Thank you for the lodging and the company." Her smile in response was like sunrise breaking over the desert, warm, brightening everything it touched. "Good night," she said again, before disappearing into the cabin. Rhett stood on the porch a while longer, staring at the stars and wondering why, for the first time in years, the prospect of continuing his solitary journey filled him with a sense of emptiness rather than freedom. The final leg of their journey to Colombia began at dawn, the eastern sky painted in shades of pink and gold as they set out from the trading post. Eliza seemed in good spirits, buoyed by the knowledge that they would reach their destination by afternoon. Rhett, however, found himself unusually quiet, his thoughts preoccupied with what would happen when they arrived. The terrain grew more hospitable as they neared Colombia, the harsh desert giving way to rolling grasslands dotted with cottonwoods and willows. Signs of civilization became more frequent: fenced pastureland, the occasional farmhouse in the distance, well-worn trails converging into proper roads. "It's beautiful," Eliza commented as they crested a hill and saw the valley below, where the town of Colombia sprawled alongside a meandering river. "More green than I expected," Rhett nodded. "The river makes all the difference, brings life to the valley." From their vantage point, they could see that Colombia had indeed grown since Rhett's last visit. What had been a scattered collection of buildings was now a proper town, with a main street lined with businesses, a church steeple rising above the rooftops, and numerous houses spreading outward from the center. "You know where your brother's homestead is?" Rhett asked as they began their descent toward the valley. "His letters said it's about 2 miles east of town," Eliza replied, scanning the landscape. "He mentioned being near a stand of cottonwoods not far from the river bend." Rhett nodded, adjusting their course slightly. "We'll skirt the town then, head east along the river. Should find it without too much trouble." As they approached Colombia, they began to pass other travelers and local residents. Farmers driving wagons loaded with produce, women carrying baskets of washing, children playing along the roadside, all signs of a thriving community. Several people nodded greetings to them, curious glances taking in the unusual sight of the travois loaded with Eliza's belongings. Rhett felt Eliza's excitement growing as they followed the river eastward, her posture straightening as she scanned each homestead they passed. When they rounded a bend and saw a neat cabin set back from the river near a magnificent stand of cottonwoods, her intake of breath told him they'd found their destination. "That's it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "That's Sam's place." The homestead was modest but well tended. The cabin was solidly built of logs with a stone chimney, a porch running along the front. Nearby stood a small barn and corral where a couple of horses grazed peacefully. A vegetable garden flourished to one side, and smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was home. As they approached, the cabin door opened and a man stepped onto the porch. He was tall and lanky, with the same sandy hair as Eliza, though his was cut short. When he shaded his eyes and spotted them coming down the road, his face broke into a wide smile. "Eliza," he called, already hurrying toward them. "Eliza, is that you, Sam?" Eliza's voice cracked with emotion as she slid down from Maverick and ran to meet her brother. Rhett hung back, watching as the siblings embraced, both laughing and crying at once. There was something both beautiful and painful about witnessing their reunion, beautiful in its genuine joy, painful in how it highlighted his own lack of such connections. After a long moment, Eliza stepped back from her brother, wiping tears from her cheeks. She turned toward Rhett, gesturing for him to approach. "Sam, this is Rhett Turner," she said as he led Maverick forward. "He saved me when my wagon broke down 2 days ago. I would have been stranded if not for him." Samuel Miller stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Turner, I can't thank you enough," he said earnestly. His grip was firm, his gaze direct and honest. "My sister is all the family I have left. I'm deeply in your debt." Rhett shook his hand, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just happened to be passing by," he said. "Anyone would have helped." "Not anyone," Samuel insisted, echoing his sister's words from the night before. "Please come inside. You must be exhausted from your journey." Before Rhett could find a reason to decline, Eliza added her own encouragement. "Please, Rhett. At least rest a while before you continue on." Faced with their combined invitation, he found himself nodding. "I should see to Maverick first," he said, indicating his horse and the travois. "Of course," Samuel agreed. "I'll help you unload my sister's belongings. The barn has plenty of room for your horse." Together, the two men unloaded the travois and cared for Maverick while Eliza went inside to freshen up. Samuel proved to be as capable and direct as his sister, working efficiently and asking practical questions about their journey. Eliza mentioned in her letters that she was traveling alone, he said as they carried the last of her trunks into the cabin. "I was worried sick about her making that journey by herself. When I realized she was days overdue, I was about to organize a search party." He shook his head. "I can't tell you how relieved I am that you found her when you did. She's a remarkable woman," Rhett found himself saying. "Handled the situation better than most would have." Samuel smiled proudly. "That's Lisa, always been the strong one." He glanced toward the cabin. "Still, I'm grateful she doesn't have to be strong alone anymore." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and living area with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs and a few pieces of well-made furniture. Doors led off to what Rhett assumed were bedrooms, and the windows were indeed glass, as Eliza had mentioned a luxury in this part of the territory. Eliza emerged from one of the rooms looking refreshed, her hair neatly arranged and her dress changed. The transformation was subtle but noticeable from travel-worn widow to composed young woman at home. "Sam, this place is wonderful," she was saying as she moved around the main room, admiring his handiwork. "Even better than you described in your letters." "It's not much," Samuel replied modestly, "but it's mine. Ours now," he corrected, smiling at his sister. "Please sit," he continued, addressing Rhett. "I'll make some coffee. You must be hungry too. I've got stew warming." Rhett found himself seated at the table while Samuel bustled about the kitchen area, and Eliza unpacked some of her belongings. The domestic scene was so far removed from his usual solitary existence that he felt almost like an intruder, observing a life he wasn't part of. Yet as they sat down to eat, both siblings made efforts to include him in their conversation, asking about his travels and sharing stories of their own. Samuel, it turned out, had indeed been courting the woman who ran the general store in town, a widow named Margaret who, according to him, was as smart as she is beautiful. "You'll meet her soon," he told Eliza. "She's been looking forward to your arrival. Says it'll be nice to have another woman in town who's read more than just the Bible and seed catalogs." Eliza laughed. "I look forward to meeting her as well." As the meal progressed, Rhett found himself unexpectedly comfortable in their company. There was an ease to the Miller siblings, a genuine warmth that drew others in. Several times, he caught Eliza watching him with a thoughtful expression, though she quickly looked away when their eyes met. When the meal was finished, Rhett knew it was time for him to leave. He'd done what he'd promised, delivered Eliza safely to her brother. There was no reason to linger. "I should be moving on," he said, standing from the table. "Got daylight left to make some distance." Both Millers looked surprised. "Surely you'll stay the night," Samuel said. "It's the least we can offer after what you've done for Eliza." "That's kind but unnecessary," Rhett replied. "I prefer to keep moving." "But what about the rest of my belongings?" Eliza asked. "You said we'd go back for them." Rhett hesitated. It was true. He had promised to help retrieve the items they'd left behind. "Your brother can probably borrow a wagon in town," he suggested. "No need for me to—" "Nonsense," Samuel interrupted. "You know exactly where Eliza's wagon is. It would take us twice as long to find it without you." "And I'd welcome the help, Mr. Turner. I can pay you for your time." Again, Rhett found himself faced with their combined insistence, and again he found it difficult to refuse. "One night," he conceded. "We can head back for the wagon tomorrow. Relief and something else pleasure." Crossed Eliza's face. "Thank you, Rhett. We do appreciate it." Samuel insisted on showing Rhett around the property while Eliza continued settling in. The homestead was well planned, with the barn and corral positioned to catch the morning sun, the garden protected from the worst of the wind by a natural ridge. A small workshop attached to the barn housed Samuel's carpentry tools and several pieces of furniture in various stages of completion. "I sell these in town," he explained, running his hand over a nearly finished rocking chair. "Started as repairs for neighbors, but word spread. Now I've got more orders than I can keep up with." "Fine work," Rhett commented, genuinely impressed by the craftsmanship. "Do you have any experience with woodworking?" Samuel asked. Rhett shrugged. "Basic skills. Built shelters, repaired wagons, nothing fine like this." "Still, sounds like you're handy with tools." Samuel looked thoughtful. "Colombia's growing fast, towns in need of men who can build and repair. If you ever decided to stay a while, I expect you'd find plenty of work." The offer was casual but sincere. Rhett nodded noncommittally, unwilling to encourage the idea even as a part of him considered it. By evening, Rhett had been provided with a comfortable bed in the small room Samuel used as his workshop, despite his insistence that he could sleep in the barn. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and the smell of fresh bread, Eliza's contribution to dinner, filled the cabin with a homely aroma. As darkness fell, they sat on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass near the river. Samuel had retired early, claiming he needed to be up before dawn to check his trap lines, leaving Rhett and Eliza alone with their thoughts and the symphony of night insects. "Thank you for agreeing to stay," Eliza said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Rhett nodded. "Your brother made a compelling case. Sam can be persuasive when he wants to be." She smiled, then grew more serious. "But I'm grateful for my own reasons as well." "Oh." Rhett glanced at her, curious. Eliza seemed to choose her words carefully. "These past few days traveling with you, they've reminded me of something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" She looked out at the darkened landscape. "That I'm stronger than I thought. That I can face challenges and overcome them." Her voice grew softer. "That there are still good men in the world." Rhett felt a warmth spread through him at her words, uncomfortable but not unwelcome. "You were already strong, Eliza. I just happened to be there when you needed an extra hand." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but sometimes we need someone else to remind us of our own strength." She turned to look at him directly. "Just as I think, perhaps, you need someone to remind you that solitude isn't the only path." Her insight struck uncomfortably close to thoughts he'd been having himself. Rhett shifted in his chair, unsure how to respond. "I've managed well enough," he finally said. "I don't doubt it," Eliza replied. "But there's a difference between surviving and living, Rhett. I think you know that." He did know it, had felt the truth of it increasingly during their journey together. But acknowledging it meant confronting choices he'd made long ago, walls he'd built around himself that now seemed more like a prison than protection. Before he could formulate a response, Eliza stood. "It's late. We should both rest if we're to retrieve my wagon tomorrow." She paused, then added, "Good night, Rhett. Sleep well." "Good night, Eliza," he replied, watching as she disappeared into the cabin. Rhett remained on the porch long after she'd gone, staring at the stars and pondering the unexpected turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd been a drifter with no destination, content, or so he'd believed with his solitary existence. Now, sitting on a porch that felt strangely welcoming, he found himself questioning everything he'd accepted as truth about himself and his life. For the first time in years, Rhett Turner wondered what it might be like to stop running, to build something lasting instead of always moving on. And for the first time in years, the thought didn't fill him with dread, but with something that felt remarkably like hope. The journey to retrieve Eliza's abandoned wagon took less time than their original trek, thanks to Samuel's sturdy farm wagon and team of horses. Rhett rode Maverick alongside, guiding them back along the route he and Eliza had traveled. The day was clear and mild, perfect for traveling, and they made good progress. Samuel Miller proved to be good company, straightforward in his manner, thoughtful in his conversation. Rhett learned that he'd come west after finding it difficult to settle back into civilian life after the war. "Couldn't seem to fit in anymore," Samuel explained as they rode. "Everything had changed, or maybe I had. Needed open spaces, room to breathe." Rhett nodded, understanding precisely what the other man meant. "Found what you were looking for here," Samuel considered this. "Found something better, I think, purpose, community." He smiled slightly. "Didn't expect that last part. Came out here thinking I wanted to be left alone. Turns out, Connections to others are what make a place feel like home. The observation hit uncomfortably close to Rhett's own circumstances. He changed the subject, asking about Colombia and its prospects, which Samuel was happy to discuss. They reached the site of Eliza's broken wagon by mid-afternoon. It was exactly as they'd left it, the canvas covering still secure over the remaining belongings. Together, they transferred everything to Samuel's wagon, then dismantled what remained of the damaged wagon for any usable parts. "Shame about this," Samuel said, examining the broken wheel. "Good wagon otherwise. My neighbor might be able to repair it given time." "Worth asking," Rhett agreed. "The axle's sound and most of the body." With the salvage operation complete, they began the journey back to Colombia. The loaded wagon moved slower than on the outward journey, and both men knew they wouldn't reach the homestead before dark. "We'll stay in town tonight," Samuel decided. "There's a decent hotel on Main Street. We can head home in the morning." The suggestion made sense, but Rhett found himself oddly reluctant to delay their return. The thought of Eliza waiting at the homestead, perhaps worried about their progress, bothered him more than he wanted to admit. As if reading his thoughts, Samuel added, "Eliza won't worry. She knows these things take time." He glanced at Rhett with a knowing expression. "She's quite taken with you, you know." Rhett nearly pulled Maverick to a halt in surprise. "I don't think. My sister doesn't impress easily, Mr. Turner," Samuel continued, seemingly amused by Rhett's discomfort. "She's had her share of suitors, both before and after her marriage. Never saw her look at any of them the way she looks at you." Rhett wasn't sure how to respond. The idea that Eliza might harbor feelings for him beyond gratitude and friendship was both thrilling and terrifying. He'd spent so long avoiding attachments that the prospect of one forming despite his intentions left him feeling exposed. "I'm not staying in Colombia," he said finally. "Just passing through." Samuel nodded, taking the statement in stride. "Of course. Though I've found life has a way of changing our plans sometimes." He flicked the reins, urging his team forward. "Just something to consider." They reached Colombia as dusk was falling, the town's buildings silhouetted against the darkening sky. Main Street was still busy with evening activity, the saloon doing brisk business, shopkeepers closing up for the day, residents strolling in the pleasant evening air. Samuel directed the wagon to a livery stable where they arranged for the horses to be cared for overnight, then led Rhett to the hotel. The Columbia house was modest by city standards, but luxurious compared to most frontier accommodations. The lobby boasted actual carpet, oil paintings on the walls, and a reception desk staffed by a clerk in a somewhat threadbare suit. "Samuel Miller," the clerk greeted warmly as they approached. "Haven't seen you in town for a spell. How's that homestead coming along?" "Just fine, Tom," Samuel replied. "My sister arrived yesterday. We're just retrieving the last of her belongings." He gestured to Rhett. "This is Mr. Turner. We'll need 2 rooms for the night." "Actually," Rhett interjected, "I think I'll stay at the saloon. They have rooms upstairs, if I recall." Samuel looked surprised. "The hotel's more comfortable." "Saloon suits me fine," Rhett insisted, suddenly eager for familiar surroundings and the anonymity of a crowded barroom. He needed space to think, to regain his equilibrium after Samuel's unexpected observations about Eliza's feelings. After a moment, Samuel nodded. "As you prefer. Meet me at the livery at 8 tomorrow. We can head back then." Rhett agreed to the plan, then took his leave, walking the short distance to the Desert Rose Saloon. The familiar sounds greeted him as he pushed through the batwing doors, the piano player banging out a lively tune, the murmur of conversation punctuated by occasional laughter, the clink of glasses and shuffle of cards. He found a place at the bar and ordered whiskey, drinking it slowly as he surveyed the room. It was a typical frontier saloon, neither better nor worse than dozens he'd frequented over the years. Women in colorful dresses circulated among the customers, some dealing cards, others simply providing companionship for a price. A poker game was in progress in one corner, the players intent on their hands. Everything about the scene was familiar, comfortable in its predictability. Yet for the first time, Rhett found himself viewing it as an outsider rather than a participant. The men hunched over their drinks seemed less like kindred spirits and more like cautionary tales, men without connections, without purpose beyond the next drink or game or temporary pleasure. Was this what he'd been choosing all these years? This rootless existence, this endless cycle of anonymous towns and forgettable faces, buying a lady a drink. A woman in a red dress slid onto the stool beside him, her heavily powdered face arranged in a practiced smile. "Not tonight," Rhett replied, more gently than he might have once done. He saw the flash of weariness behind her painted smile, the calculation of how many drinks she needed to sell to meet whatever quota the establishment demanded. She shrugged, already moving on to the next prospect. "Your loss, Cowboy." Rhett finished his whiskey and considered ordering another. Instead, he paid his tab and inquired about a room for the night. The barkeep directed him upstairs, where he found accommodations that were basic but clean enough: a narrow bed, washstand, and chair being the extent of the furnishings. Lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, Rhett found his thoughts returning to Eliza. Samuel's words echoed in his mind. "She's quite taken with you." Was it possible? And if it was, what did it mean for him? The thought of pursuing something with Eliza was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. She was everything he admired in a woman: strong, intelligent, resilient. In their short time together, she'd shown a quiet courage that impressed him more than any grand gestures could have. And yes, he was attracted to her, had been from the first moment he saw her beside her broken wagon. But a relationship would mean staying, committing to something beyond himself. It would mean opening himself to the possibility of loss again, a risk he'd spent years avoiding. Rhett closed his eyes, suddenly exhausted by the circular nature of his thoughts. Tomorrow, they would return to Samuel's homestead. Tomorrow, he would see Eliza again. And tomorrow, he would need to decide whether to ride away as he'd always done, or consider a different path. For now, he let sleep claim him, the distant sounds of the saloon below fading as he drifted into dreams filled with green eyes and a smile that felt like sunrise. Morning arrived with the bustle of a town coming to life. Rhett woke early, as was his habit, and made his way downstairs. The saloon was quiet now, a young man sweeping up the previous night's debris while the barkeep tallied receipts. Rhett stepped outside into the fresh morning air, taking a moment to observe Colombia in daylight. Main Street stretched before him, lined with businesses that showed the town's prosperity: a general store, blacksmith, barbershop, dressmaker, and several others. People moved purposefully about their morning routines, nodding greetings to one another as they passed. A group of children ran toward a building Rhett assumed was the schoolhouse, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. It was, he had to admit, a pleasant scene. Colombia had the feel of a place with a future, a community rather than just a collection of buildings. After a simple breakfast at a small cafe, Rhett made his way to the livery stable, where he found Samuel already checking the wagon and team. "Thought I might have to come looking for you," Samuel commented as Rhett approached. "Not everyone appreciates an early start." "Been up since dawn," Rhett replied. "Habit from years on the trail." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Same here. Never could sleep past first light, even when I have the chance." They set out shortly after, the loaded wagon moving steadily along the road that led east out of town. The morning was fine, with a clear sky promising another warm day. As they traveled, Samuel pointed out various landmarks and neighboring homesteads, filling Rhett in on the local community. "That's the Thompson place," he said, indicating a well-maintained farm to the north. "Good people. Their son's the town blacksmith, now married Margaret's daughter last spring." Rhett listened, noting how interconnected everyone seemed to be. It was so different from his own existence, where relationships were temporary at best. "And there's Doc Wilson's property," Samuel continued, nodding toward a smaller homestead set back from the road. "He's getting on in years now, talking about needing someone younger to take over his practice. Not many doctors willing to settle in places like Colombia," Rhett observed. "True enough," Samuel agreed. "Makes it hard when folks get sick or injured." Margaret's been trying to convince her nephew he's studying medicine back east to consider joining his uncle when he finishes his training. The conversation continued in this vein as they made their way back to the Miller homestead. By the time they arrived, it was approaching midday. Eliza emerged from the cabin as they pulled up, her face lighting with pleasure at their return. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd decided to stay in town," she called, walking toward the wagon. "Nearly did," Samuel replied with a grin. "But I knew you'd be eager to get the rest of your belongings." Rhett felt his heart quicken at the sight of her. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder. The domestic scene Eliza standing before the cabin, welcoming them home, struck him with unexpected force. "Everything was just as we left it," he told her as he dismounted from Maverick. "No trouble with the retrieval." "I'm glad to hear it," Eliza replied, her eyes meeting his briefly before moving to the wagon. "Though I see you've brought back my poor broken wheel as well." "Samuel thinks it might be repairable," Rhett explained. "Worth trying," Samuel added. "No sense wasting good materials out here." Together, the three of them unloaded the wagon, carrying Eliza's remaining belongings into the cabin. The work went quickly with all of them helping, and by early afternoon, everything had been stored away. "I'll ride into town tomorrow to see about getting that wheel fixed," Samuel said as they sat down to a late lunch Eliza had prepared. "And to introduce Eliza to Margaret." "I look forward to meeting her," Eliza said, passing a plate of biscuits to Rhett. "From everything you've said, she sounds wonderful." "She is," Samuel confirmed, a slight flush coloring his neck. "She's organizing a social for next Saturday, says it's to welcome you to Colombia, but I think she's just looking for an excuse to gather folks together." "A social?" Eliza looked pleased. "That's very kind of her." "Nothing formal," Samuel assured her. "Just neighbors getting together for food and conversation. Maybe some music if the Anderson boys bring their fiddles." Rhett listened to their plans, acutely aware that they were discussing a future he wouldn't be part of. He'd done what he'd promised, helped retrieve Eliza's belongings. There was no reason for him to stay longer. "Will you be joining us, Rhett?" Eliza's question pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to find both siblings watching him expectantly. "For the social? I don't expect to be in Colombia that long." A flicker of disappointment crossed Eliza's face, though she quickly concealed it. "Of course. You mentioned you were just passing through." Samuel gave him a measured look. "No rush to decide now. Plenty can happen in a week." The conversation moved on, but Rhett remained conscious of Eliza's subdued manner for the remainder of the meal. When they finished eating, Samuel excused himself to tend to some repairs in the barn, leaving Rhett and Eliza alone at the table. "I should probably see about moving on," Rhett said after a moment of awkward silence. "Done what I can here." Eliza nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Of course, you've already done far more than most would have." She hesitated, then added, though you're welcome to stay longer if you wanted to." The invitation hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Rhett found himself wanting to accept, to see where this unexpected connection between them might lead. But old habits and fears were powerful forces. "It's best if I keep moving," he said, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "Always been my way." Eliza studied him, disappointment evident in her eyes despite her attempt to hide it. "Is that truly what you want, Rhett? To always be moving, never staying anywhere long enough to build anything lasting?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "It's what I know," he answered honestly. "That's not the same thing," she pointed out gently. "What we know and what we want, what might bring us happiness, aren't always the same." Rhett couldn't find a response to that. Eliza was right, of course. He'd been following a path for so long that he'd stopped questioning whether it was leading him anywhere he actually wanted to go. After a moment, she stood and began clearing the dishes. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done. Not just rescuing me from my predicament with the wagon, but for showing me kindness when I needed it most." Her simple gratitude made his planned departure feel increasingly wrong, like abandoning something precious just as it was beginning. Before he could examine that feeling further, Samuel returned from the barn. "Rhett, if you're not in a hurry, I could use your help with something this afternoon," he said. "Got a section of fence that needs repairing before dark." The request offered Rhett a temporary reprieve from his decision. "Happy to help," he agreed, perhaps too quickly. The afternoon passed in productive labor, with Rhett and Samuel working side by side to mend the broken fence section. The physical work was familiar and satisfying, giving Rhett's hands something to do while his mind continued to wrestle with the choice before him. Samuel proved to be a thoughtful companion, seeming to sense Rhett's internal struggle and respecting his silence. They worked efficiently together, and by the time the sun was beginning to lower in the western sky, the fence was repaired. "Appreciate the help," Samuel said as they gathered their tools. "Goes twice as fast with two pairs of hands." Rhett nodded, surveying their work. "Glad to be useful." As they walked back toward the cabin, Samuel paused, turning to face Rhett directly. "I don't mean to overstep," he began, "but I feel I should speak plainly." Rhett steeled himself, suspecting what was coming. "My sister has known more than her share of loss," Samuel continued. "When Edward died, I worried she might never recover her spirit, seeing her now with you." He shook his head slightly. "There's a light in her eyes I hadn't expected to see again so soon." Rhett shifted uncomfortably. "I haven't done anything special." "Haven't you?" Samuel countered. "You helped her when she needed it, treated her with respect, listened to her. Might not seem special to you, but it clearly means something to her." The observation left Rhett struggling for a response. "I'm not suggesting you change your plans on her account," Samuel added. "Just that you consider whether those plans are what you truly want, or simply what you're used to." It was the second time in one day Rhett had been confronted with that distinction, and the repetition made it impossible to ignore. Were his wandering ways a choice or a habit, a path to freedom or an avoidance of deeper connections? "I'll think on it," he promised, the most honest answer he could give. Samuel seemed satisfied with that. That's all anyone can ask. When they reached the cabin, the smell of cooking greeted them. Eliza had prepared a hearty stew for dinner, along with fresh baked bread. The domestic scene was so warm and inviting that Rhett felt a physical ache at the thought of leaving it behind. The evening passed pleasantly, with conversation flowing more easily than Rhett would have expected. Eliza shared stories of her teaching days in St. Louis, while Samuel described the challenges and rewards of building his homestead from nothing. Rhett found himself contributing tales from his travels that made both siblings laugh, stories he hadn't thought about in years, memories that had been buried beneath the weight of his solitude. As night fell, they moved to the porch, where Samuel produced a bottle of decent whiskey to share. The evening was mild, with a crescent moon rising over the eastern hills and a chorus of frogs singing near the river. "Nights like this make all the hard work worthwhile," Samuel commented, sipping his whiskey. "Sometimes I just sit out here and think about how far I've come from those battlefield hospitals." "It's a good life you've built," Rhett acknowledged. "It is," Samuel agreed. "Though it would be better with someone to share it." He glanced toward the cabin where Eliza had gone to prepare for bed. "Having Eliza here helps. Family matters." Rhett nodded, thinking of his own lack of family connections. For years, he'd told himself it was better that way. No attachments meant no loss, no pain. But sitting here on this peaceful porch, he could see the emptiness of that philosophy. "What about you, Rhett?" Samuel asked. "Ever think about setting down roots somewhere?" "Not for a long time," Rhett admitted. "After the war seemed easier to keep moving." "Easier, maybe," Samuel agreed, "but not better." They fell silent, each man lost in his own thoughts as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Later, alone in the workshop room where he'd slept the previous night, Rhett found himself unable to rest. His mind kept returning to Eliza, her green eyes, her quiet strength, the way she'd looked at him with hope and something deeper that he was afraid to name. For the first time in years, the prospect of riding away held no appeal. The freedom of the open road suddenly seemed less like liberation and more like an endless cycle, leading nowhere, building nothing. Rhett Turner had spent 7 years running from attachments, convincing himself that solitude was preferable to risk. But in the space of a few days, a woman with a broken wagon and an unbroken spirit had made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. As dawn approached, he came to a decision. He would stay not permanently, not with any grand declarations, but long enough to see if the feelings growing between him and Eliza might lead somewhere worth exploring. Long enough to discover if Colombia might offer something he hadn't known he was searching for. It was a small step, but for a man who had spent years running, the choice to stay even temporarily felt momentous. Morning found Rhett already awake and outside, tending to Maverick as the sun crested the eastern hills. The decision he'd reached during the night left him feeling strangely lightened, as if he'd set down a burden he'd been carrying for years. Eliza emerged from the cabin, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. Her expression brightened when she saw him, though she approached cautiously, perhaps expecting him to announce his departure. "You're up early," she commented, stopping a few feet away. "Always am," he replied, brushing Maverick's coat with steady strokes. "Used to dawn patrols during the war, never broke the habit," she nodded, watching his movements. "Will you be leaving today?" Rhett paused, then turned to face her directly. "No," he said simply. "Not today." The hope that bloomed in her eyes was unmistakable, though she tried to temper it. "Oh, have you decided to stay for a while then?" "Thought I might," Rhett acknowledged, feeling oddly vulnerable in his admission. "Samuel mentioned there's work in town, might be worth looking into." Eliza's smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert, warm, brightening everything it touched. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the joy evident in her expression. "Colombia seems to be growing. I'm sure your skills would be valuable." Rhett nodded, returning to his grooming of Maverick to hide his own pleased reaction to her approval. "We'll see. No promises about how long I'll stay." "Of course," Eliza agreed, though something in her tone suggested she understood his caution for what it was, a hedge against hope, a protection against disappointment. "Will you come into town with us today? Sam wants to introduce me to Margaret, and you could inquire about work while we're there." The invitation was casual, but Rhett recognized it for what it was, a first step toward including him in their lives. "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with how true the words felt. When Samuel emerged from the cabin a short while later, he seemed unsurprised by Rhett's decision to accompany them to town. "Thought you might," was all he said, with a knowing glance between Rhett and Eliza that made both of them look away in momentary embarrassment. The ride to Colombia was pleasant, with the three of them sharing the bench of Samuel's wagon. Eliza sat between the two men, her presence a warm reminder to Rhett of his decision to stay. Several times during the journey, their shoulders or arms brushed against each other, each contact sending an unexpected current through him. Colombia looked even more impressive by day than it had the previous evening. Main Street bustled with activity, wagons delivering goods, shoppers moving between businesses, workers constructing what looked to be a new building at the far end of town. Samuel directed the wagon to a hitching post in front of a large general store with a sign that read, "Hampton's Mercantile." Before they had even fully stopped, the door opened and a woman emerged, her face lighting with pleasure at the sight of them. "Samuel Miller, I was beginning to think you'd forgotten the way to town," she called, moving toward the wagon with confident steps. Margaret Hampton was perhaps 40, with dark hair showing the first strands of silver at her temples and warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She wore a practical dress of deep blue, with a white apron over it that identified her as the store's proprietor. "Margaret," Samuel greeted, a slight flush coloring his face as he helped her up into the wagon. "I'd like you to meet my sister, Eliza. She arrived a few days ago from St. Louis." "Mrs. Hampton," Eliza said, extending her hand. "I've heard so much about you from Sam's letters." "All good things, I hope," Margaret replied with a warm smile, clasping Eliza's hand in both of hers. "And please call me Margaret. We don't stand on formality much in Colombia." Her gaze shifted to Rhett, curiosity evident in her expression. "And who is this gentleman?" "Sam didn't mention he was bringing two guests." "Rhett Turner, madam." Rhett introduced himself with a nod. "I had the good fortune to meet Mrs. Miller when her wagon broke down on her journey here. Mr. Turner rescued me," Eliza elaborated. "I'd still be stranded in the desert if not for his help." "Well, we're certainly glad you found her," Margaret said, her shrewd eyes taking in the way Rhett and Eliza sat close together on the wagon bench. "Any friend of the Millers is welcome in Colombia." She turned back to Samuel. "Now, I thought we might have lunch at the hotel. The dining room there is quite respectable, and it will give Eliza a chance to see some of Colombia's better establishments." The plan was quickly agreed to, and soon they were seated at a table in the hotel dining room, where Margaret proved to be a lively conversationalist and an excellent source of information about Colombia and its residents. "The town's growing faster than anyone expected," she explained as they enjoyed their meal. "The railroad spur they put in last year changed everything. Suddenly, we're connected to markets in Denver and beyond. New businesses opening monthly, families moving in, even talk of a proper schoolhouse instead of the one-room affair we've been using." At the mention of a school, Eliza's interest visibly piqued. "Do you have a teacher currently?" she asked. Margaret smiled knowingly. "We do, but Mrs. Abernathy is expecting her third child and has made it clear she won't be returning afterward. Her husband's farm is doing well enough that she wants to focus on their family." She looked at Eliza with speculative eyes. "Sam mentioned you were a teacher in St. Louis." "I was," Eliza confirmed. before I married, and for a while after Edward died. The school board will be meeting next week to discuss finding a replacement, Margaret said. If you're interested, I'd be happy to speak to them on your behalf. Eliza's face lit up with genuine excitement. I would be very interested. Teaching is my passion. Rhett watched her animation with pleasure, seeing how the prospect of returning to her profession energized her. This was the woman he'd glimpsed beneath the grief and weariness when he first found her beside her broken wagon, vibrant, purposeful, full of life. "And what about you, Mr. Turner?" Margaret asked, turning her attention to him. "What brings you to Colombia, besides your gallant rescue of Eliza?" Rhett hesitated, still uncomfortable with defining his plans too specifically. "Just looking for work at the moment," he said. "Samuel mentioned the town needs men who can build." "Indeed it does," Margaret confirmed. "In fact, my nephew, my late husband's nephew, to be precise, is the contractor for several new buildings in town. He's constantly complaining about the lack of skilled workers." She studied Rhett appraisingly. "Have you experience with construction?" "Some," Rhett acknowledged. "I've worked on various projects over the years. Nothing fancy, but I understand the basics of sound building." "Excellent," Margaret declared. "You must speak with James, that's my nephew. His office is just down the street. If you'd like, we can stop there after lunch." The offer was made casually, but Rhett recognized it for what it was: the beginning of connections, the first threads of a possible future in Colombia. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I'd appreciate that," he said, committing himself a little further to staying. The rest of the meal passed pleasantly, with conversation flowing easily among the four of them. Rhett found himself drawn into discussions about Colombia's development, offering observations from his travels that the others found valuable. It was strange but satisfying to be treated as someone with something to contribute rather than just a drifter passing through. After lunch, true to her word, Margaret led them to a small office on a side street where James Hampton, a serious young man with his aunt's dark eyes, listened to Rhett's experience and immediately offered him work. "Can you start tomorrow?" he asked after their brief discussion. "I've got a crew putting up a new boarding house on the east end of town, and I'm short-handed." Rhett glanced at Eliza, who was trying not to look too pleased by this development, then nodded. "I can start tomorrow," he confirmed. "Good wages, paid weekly," James added. "And if you prove reliable, there's plenty more work after this job's done." As they left the office, Rhett felt a curious mixture of emotions. Part of him wondered if he'd just trapped himself by accepting the job, while another part that seemed to be growing stronger felt something like satisfaction at the prospect of productive work and a place to belong, even temporarily. The rest of the afternoon was spent showing Eliza around Colombia, with Margaret as their enthusiastic guide. The town was indeed prospering, with new construction visible in several areas and a general air of optimism among its residents. Margaret introduced them to numerous shopkeepers and citizens, all of whom welcomed Eliza warmly and regarded Rhett with friendly curiosity. "You'll need a place to stay if you're working in town," Samuel mentioned as they prepared to return to the homestead late in the day. "The boarding house on Cedar Street is respectable, and the rates are fair." "I'll look into it," Rhett agreed, though the thought of returning to anonymous lodgings held less appeal than it once would have. As they drove back to Samuel's homestead, Eliza sat close beside him on the wagon bench, her shoulder occasionally brushing against his. Neither spoke much, but Rhett was acutely aware of her presence, of the subtle changes that had occurred between them in the space of a few short days. That evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Eliza finally addressed what had been implicit all day. "I'm glad you've decided to stay in Colombia," she said softly, while Samuel was inside preparing coffee. Even if it's just for a while. Rhett looked at her in the fading light, struck anew by her beauty and the quiet strength she carried. "I'm not making any promises about how long," he cautioned. "Old habits die hard." "I understand," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I hope you'll give Colombia a chance. Give yourself a chance to see if there might be something here worth staying for." The unspoken someone hung in the air between them, as clear as if she'd said it aloud. Rhett found himself wanting to reach for her hand, to bridge the small physical distance that seemed to represent so much more. Before he could act on the impulse, Samuel returned with coffee, and the moment passed. Yet as the evening continued, Rhett felt something shifting within him, a willingness to consider possibilities he'd denied himself for years, a tentative opening to hope. The next morning, Rhett rode Maverick into Colombia to begin his new job. The work was straightforward, helping to frame the new boarding house under the direction of James Hampton's foreman. The crew consisted of a mix of longtime Colombia residents and newer arrivals, all of whom accepted Rhett without much questioning beyond his construction experience. The physical labor was satisfying, the camaraderie of working alongside others unexpectedly pleasant. By the end of the day, Rhett had earned both his wages and the respect of the foreman, who nodded approvingly at his work. "You know what you're doing," the man commented as they cleaned up the site. "Not everyone who comes through here can say the same." Rhett acknowledged the compliment with a nod, realizing he felt a pride in his work that had been absent in many of his temporary jobs over the years. There was something meaningful about building something that would last, that would serve a purpose in this growing community. After securing lodgings at the boarding house Samuel had recommended, Rhett found himself with an unexpected invitation to dinner at Margaret Hampton's home, along with the Millers. The evening was enjoyable, with good food and better conversation. Rhett observed the obvious affection between Samuel and Margaret, noting how they seemed to complement each other, Samuel's quiet steadiness balancing Margaret's more outgoing nature. More surprising was how easily he himself fit into their small gathering. Eliza sat beside him at dinner, her presence both comforting and exhilarating. Several times, he caught her watching him with an expression that made his heart quicken, a look of such open admiration and interest that it was impossible to misinterpret. The week passed in a similar fashion, days spent working on the boarding house, evenings often in the company of Eliza and her brother, sometimes at the homestead, other times in town. Rhett found himself settling into a routine that felt increasingly natural, his habitual wariness gradually giving way to a cautious enjoyment of his new circumstances. On Friday evening, as he walked Eliza back to the general store after dinner at the hotel, Samuel, having stayed behind to help Margaret close up her shop, Rhett finally found the courage to address what had been building between them. "Tomorrow's that social Samuel mentioned," he said as they strolled along the moonlit street. Eliza nodded, her face partly shadowed but her voice warm. "Yes, at Margaret's home. It seems half the town is planning to attend. Would you?" Rhett paused, feeling oddly nervous. "Would you allow me to escort you?" Eliza stopped walking, turning to face him fully. In the silver moonlight, her expression was one of surprised pleasure. "I would like that very much, Rhett." Their eyes held for a long moment, the connection between them almost tangible in the quiet night air. Rhett felt drawn to her, the urge to close the distance between them nearly overwhelming. "Eliza," he began, his voice lower than he intended, "I need to be honest with you. I don't know where we might be heading. I've spent so long avoiding attachments that I'm not sure I remember how to form them properly." Her smile was gentle, understanding. "I'm not asking for certainties, Rhett, After Edward died, I thought I'd never want to risk my heart again." She took a small step closer to him. "But then I met you and something changed. All I'm asking is that we both be open to possibilities." The simplicity of her request, its honesty and lack of pressure, touched him deeply. "I can do that," he promised, reaching for her hand, her fingers twined with his, warm and sure. They stood that way for a moment, connected by that simple touch, both aware that something significant had changed between them. When Rhett finally walked her to the back entrance of the store where she was staying in Margaret's guest room, their parting was marked by a brief, tender kiss, a gentle promise of more to come, a confirmation of feelings neither was quite ready to name. The next evening's social at Margaret Hampton's home proved to be a turning point. Rhett arrived at the appointed time to escort Eliza, finding her waiting on the small porch behind the general store. She wore a dress of deep green that enhanced the color of her eyes, her hair arranged in an elegant style that framed her face beautifully. "You look lovely," Rhett said, the words inadequate to express how she affected him. Eliza's smile was radiant. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." He'd made an effort with his appearance, purchasing a new shirt and having his good suit pressed at the hotel. The expense seemed justified by the appreciation in Eliza's eyes as she took his arm. Margaret's home was already filled with guests when they arrived, a diverse gathering of Colombia's residents, from prominent business owners to farmers from the surrounding countryside. Rhett recognized several men from the construction crew, along with shopkeepers he'd met during the week. Samuel greeted them at the door, looking pleased to see them together. "Glad you could make it," he said, with a meaningful glance at their linked arms. "Most everyone's here already. Come in and let me introduce you around, Eliza." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Eliza was welcomed warmly by all, her natural charm and intelligence making a favorable impression. Rhett found himself included in these interactions, introduced not as a drifter passing through, but as someone connected to the Miller family. "Mr. Turner has been working with James on the new boarding house," Margaret explained to one group. "James says he's one of the most skilled workers he's hired." The casual praise, and the way it established him as a contributing member of the community, gave Rhett an unexpected sense of belonging. When the conversation turned to the school board's search for a new teacher, he felt pride hearing several people express interest in Eliza's qualifications. "We're meeting Tuesday to discuss candidates," an older gentleman who introduced himself as Judge Wilson informed her. "But I must say, Mrs. Miller, your experience in St. Louis is impressive. We'd be fortunate to have someone with your background here in Colombia." Eliza's face glowed with pleased anticipation. "I would be honored to be considered, Judge Wilson. Teaching has always been my calling." As the evening progressed, music began. The Anderson brothers that Samuel had mentioned bringing out their fiddles while another man joined in with a harmonica. Chairs were pushed back, creating space for dancing in Margaret's parlor. Samuel led Margaret onto the makeshift dance floor, his usually reserved manner giving way to evident joy as he twirled her to the lively tune. Other couples joined them, filling the room with movement and laughter. Rhett turned to Eliza, extending his hand. "May I have this dance?" Her smile was answer enough as she placed her hand in his. They moved together into the dancing area, joining the other couples in a simple country dance. Rhett hadn't danced in years, but his body remembered the steps, and Eliza followed his lead with natural grace. As the music slowed to a waltz, Rhett drew her closer, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. The proximity was intoxicating, her scent something floral and uniquely her, filling his senses. They moved together as if they'd danced 100 times before, their bodies finding a natural rhythm that matched the music and something deeper. "I never expected this," Rhett said quietly, for her ears alone. "When I found you by that broken wagon, I never imagined we'd be here like this." Eliza's eyes met his, filled with emotion. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. "I had resigned myself to a quiet existence with Sam, focusing on teaching if I could find a position. I never thought I'd feel this way again." "And how do you feel?" Rhett asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Alive," she answered simply. "Hopeful. As if something I thought was ended forever is just beginning again." She hesitated, then added softly, "What about you, Rhett? How do you feel?" The question demanded honesty, deserved it. "Scared," he admitted. "And more certain than I've been about anything in years, being with you. It makes me want things I've spent a long time convincing myself I didn't need." Her hand tightened on his shoulder, a gentle encouragement. "Such as roots," he said. "A home, someone to share my life with." He took a deep breath. "A future that's more than just moving from place to place, always alone." Eliza's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. "I want those things too," she whispered. "And I want them with you, Rhett, if you're willing to try." In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of community and holding the woman who had unexpectedly captured his heart, Rhett Turner made a decision that would change the course of his life. "I'm willing," he promised. "More than willing." Their dance continued, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings too strong to ignore, a commitment to explore whatever future might be possible together. Later, as they walked back to the general store under a canopy of stars, Rhett's arm around Eliza's shoulders and her head leaning against him, the peace that filled him was unlike anything he'd known before. It wasn't the temporary respite of a night's rest before moving on, but something deeper and more lasting, the peace of having found, at last, a place and a person worth staying for. "Stay with us tonight," Eliza said as they reached the store. "At Sam's, I mean. It's late, and the ride back to town can wait until morning." Rhett hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that." They rode back to the homestead together on Maverick, Eliza seated before him, her back against his chest. The night was clear and cool, the road illuminated by moonlight. Neither spoke much, content in their closeness and the unspoken understanding between them. Samuel had remained in town, planning to escort Margaret home after the last guests departed. The homestead was quiet as they arrived, the cabin dark except for a single lamp left burning in the window. Inside, Rhett built up the fire while Eliza prepared a pot of coffee. The domestic scene felt right, natural, as if they'd been sharing such evenings for years rather than days. "You think you could be happy here?" Eliza asked as they sat together before the fire. "In Colombia, I mean." Rhett considered the question seriously. "I think I could," he answered honestly. "It's a good town, growing in the right ways. There's work I find satisfying, people worth knowing." He looked at her directly. "And there's you." Eliza's smile was soft, intimate. "And if I get the teaching position?" "Then you'll be doing work you love," Rhett said. "Building something important. I'd be proud to see that." "We'd both be building," she observed. "You with your hands, me with minds and hearts, creating things that last." The symmetry of it appealed to him, both of them contributing to Colombia's future in their own ways, both finding purpose after years of loss and uncertainty. "I'd need to find a more permanent place to live," Rhett said, thinking aloud. "The boarding house is fine for now, but if I'm staying—" "There's land available," Eliza suggested. "Sam would know which parcels, if you wanted something of your own." The idea of owning land, of building a home, was both daunting and deeply appealing. "It's been a long time since I thought in those terms," Rhett admitted. "Having a place that's mine." "Roots," Roots can be a source of strength, Eliza reminded him, echoing their conversation from days earlier. Not just a tie that binds. Looking at her in the firelight, Rhett could see the truth of that statement. The connection forming between them didn't feel like a constraint but like a foundation, something solid to build upon. "I'd like that," he said finally. "A place of my own, a future here." Eliza's face lit with happiness. "I'm glad," she said simply. They stayed by the fire until it burned low, talking of possibilities, sharing hopes and plans with a freedom that came from knowing they were building something together. When it grew late, they reluctantly parted Eliza to her room, Rhett to the workshop where he'd slept before. Lying in the darkness, Rhett marveled at how quickly and completely his life had changed. 1 week ago, he'd been a solitary rider with no destination in mind, a man who prided himself on needing no one and nothing beyond his horse and the open road. Now, he was contemplating land ownership, permanent work, and a relationship with a woman who made him feel truly alive for the first time in years. The transformation should have terrified him. Instead, he felt a sense of rightness, as if he'd been traveling a long, circuitous route that had finally led him exactly where he needed to be. The weeks that followed brought rapid changes for both Rhett and Eliza. As expected, the school board offered Eliza the teaching position, impressed by her experience and references from St. Louis. She accepted with enthusiasm, throwing herself into preparations for the fall term with characteristic dedication. Rhett continued working on the boarding house construction, earning the respect of his colleagues and the trust of James Hampton, who began consulting him on aspects of the design. The work was satisfying, allowing Rhett to use skills he'd developed over years of travel, while learning new techniques from the more experienced builders. Their courtship progressed naturally, with Rhett visiting the Miller homestead regularly and escorting Eliza to various community events in Colombia. They became a recognized couple, their story how Rhett had found Eliza stranded with her broken wagon becoming something of a local legend, embellished slightly with each retelling. Samuel, observing their growing closeness with approval, offered Rhett a partnership of sorts. "I've more land than I can manage alone," he explained one evening as they sat on the porch, "and more carpentry orders than I can fill. If you're serious about staying in Colombia, I could use a partner, not just hired help." The offer was generous and practical. After careful consideration, Rhett accepted. "I appreciate the opportunity," he told Samuel, "though I'd still like to put something toward it, make it a true partnership." Samuel nodded, respecting Rhett's pride. "The parcel to the west of my property is available," he suggested. "Good land with access to the river. Would make a fine homestead of your own while being close enough for us to work together effectively." The idea appealed to Rhett immensely. When he discussed it with Eliza, her eyes lit with pleasure. "It would be perfect," she agreed. "Close enough to visit easily, but your own place to build as you choose." With his savings from the construction work and a loan arranged through Margaret's connections at the bank, Rhett purchased the land. It was a momentous step, his first real commitment to permanence in many years. Standing on his property, surveying the gentle slope toward the river and the stand of cottonwoods that marked the western boundary, Rhett felt a sense of ownership and possibility that was entirely new to him. "What will you build first?" Eliza asked as they walked the land together one evening, hand in hand. Rhett had been giving this considerable thought. "A cabin to start," he said. "Something solid but simple that I can expand later. The barn will come next. Maverick deserves better than a temporary shelter." He didn't say aloud what they both were thinking, that the cabin and future expansions would be designed with more than just his needs in mind. Their relationship had deepened steadily, their feelings for each other growing more certain with each passing day. Though neither had spoken of marriage explicitly, it was an unspoken understanding between them, a future they were both moving toward. Construction of Rhett's cabin began in early August, with Samuel, James Hampton, and several men from the boarding house crew volunteering their help. The work progressed quickly, with Rhett incorporating design elements he'd admired in various structures during his travels: large windows to capture the light, a deep porch for sitting on summer evenings, a stone fireplace that would warm the entire space during winter. Eliza contributed her own ideas, suggesting built-in shelves for books and a kitchen layout that would be practical for someone who enjoyed cooking. Neither commented on her intimate involvement with the planning, but both recognized its significance. By late September, as Eliza began her first term as Colombia's schoolteacher, the cabin was habitable. It was a proud moment when Rhett moved his few possessions from the boarding house to his own home, claiming the space as truly his. The evening of his first night in the cabin, he invited Eliza, Samuel, and Margaret for dinner. Though the furnishings were still minimal: a table and chairs, a bed behind a privacy screen, some cooking utensils, the space felt welcoming, the beginning of something rather than just shelter. "To new beginnings," Samuel toasted, raising his glass as they sat around the table Rhett had crafted himself. "And to finding hope in unexpected places," Eliza added, her eyes meeting Rhett's with a warmth that made his heart swell. Later, after Samuel and Margaret had departed, Eliza lingered, helping Rhett wash the dishes and put the small kitchen in order. The domesticity of the moment felt right, natural, as if they'd been sharing such tasks for years. Standing beside her at the wash basin, Rhett was struck anew by how completely this woman had changed his life in just a few short months. From solitary drifter to landowner, from avoiding attachments to embracing them, the transformation was profound. "What are you thinking?" Eliza asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Rhett took the plate she was drying and set it aside, then turned to face her fully. "I'm thinking that I love you," he said simply, "and that finding you beside that broken wagon was the best thing that ever happened to me." Eliza's eyes filled with emotion. "I love you too, Rhett, more than I thought possible." He took her hands in his heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and certainty. "I know we haven't spoken of it directly, but I hope you know that I built this cabin with both of us in mind. That everything I've done since deciding to stay in Colombia has been with the hope that you might share it all with me someday." "I've hoped the same," Eliza admitted softly. Taking a deep breath, Rhett continued, "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, Eliza. But I know what I want, what I need." He squeezed her hands gently. "I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to support your teaching and create a home where both of us can thrive." He paused, then added simply, "Will you marry me, Eliza?" Her answer was immediate and joyful. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, Rhett, I will marry you." The kiss that followed sealed their promise, tender at first, then deepening with the love and passion that had grown between them. When they finally drew apart, both were smiling, their hearts full with the future they would build together. They were married on a brilliant October day, with the cottonwoods along the river turned to gold and the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The ceremony took place in Colombia's small church, filled to capacity with the friends they'd made over the past months. Samuel stood as Rhett's best man, while Margaret served as Eliza's matron of honor. Eliza wore a dress of ivory satin, simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to her mother. Rhett, in a new suit purchased for the occasion, watched her walk down the aisle with a sense of wonder that this remarkable woman had chosen to share her life with him. Their vows were straightforward and heartfelt, each promising to love, honor, and support the other through whatever challenges and joys life might bring. As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that symbolized their endless commitment, Rhett felt a peace settle over him that he'd searched for without realizing it throughout his years of wandering. The celebration afterward at Margaret's home was joyous, with music and dancing lasting well into the evening. When they finally departed for their cabin, their home, Rhett lifted Eliza into the wagon he'd decorated with ribbons and flowers for the occasion, both of them laughing with the pure happiness of the moment. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their cabin, Eliza nestled against his chest. Rhett reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. "If my wagon hadn't broken down," Eliza murmured, as if reading his thoughts, "if you hadn't happened to pass by at that exact time, it seems like such a chance occurrence that changed everything." Rhett tightened his arm around her. "Maybe it wasn't chance," he suggested. "Maybe, after all those years of riding alone, I was finally heading where I needed to be to you." Eliza lifted her head to look at him, her expression tender in the moonlight filtering through the window. "I like to think so," she said. "That we were always moving toward each other, even when we didn't know it." As they drifted toward sleep, Rhett Turner no longer a solitary rider but a man with roots, a home, and a love he'd never thought to find, knew with absolute certainty that his long journey had ended exactly where it was meant to. 5 years later, the Turner homestead had transformed from a simple cabin to a proper home. Rhett had expanded the original structure, adding rooms as their family grew. The front porch, his favorite feature, wrapped around 2 sides of the house, providing the perfect place to watch sunsets over the river or observe their children playing in the yard. Elizabeth Ann Turner, now 4 years old and the image of her mother with her green eyes and determined spirit, chased her younger brother, Samuel James, around the cottonwood tree that shaded their play area. At 2, Sam was sturdy and adventurous, constantly trying to keep up with his sister. Rhett watched them from the porch steps where he was mending a bridle, his skilled hands working the leather as his eyes followed his children's antics. The sight never failed to fill him with a profound gratitude. This family he'd created with Eliza, this life so different from his solitary existence before. Colombia had grown considerably in the 5 years since their marriage. The railroad connection had brought more settlers, more businesses, more opportunities. The town now boasted a proper schoolhouse where Eliza continued to teach, though she had taken a year's leave after each child was born. The partnership with Samuel had flourished as well, their carpentry business gaining a reputation throughout the territory for quality work. Samuel had married Margaret 2 years after Rhett and Eliza's wedding, bringing their small family circle even closer. Rhett's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a wagon approaching. Looking up, he smiled as he recognized Eliza returning from town, where she'd gone to purchase supplies and check on the schoolhouse preparations for the fall term. She waved as she drew near, her face lighting with the smile that still made his heart skip a beat after all this time. The children, spotting their mother, abandoned their game and raced toward the wagon with excited calls. "Mama! Mama! Look what I made!" Elizabeth held up a somewhat lopsided daisy chain as Rhett helped Eliza down from the wagon. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Eliza assured her, admiring the creation before scooping up Sam, who was demanding his share of attention by tugging at her skirt. "And how's my little man?" "Have you been helping your papa today?" Sam nodded solemnly. "Fix horses," he declared, pointing to the bridle in Rhett's hand. "That's right," Rhett confirmed, ruffling his son's dark hair so like his own. "Best helper I could ask for." Eliza smiled, shifting Sam to her hip as she leaned in to kiss Rhett in greeting. The casual intimacy of the gesture, the ease between them after 5 years of marriage, was something Rhett never took for granted. "How was town?" he asked as they walked toward the house, Elizabeth dancing ahead of them. "Busy," Eliza replied. "The new mercantile is finally open and everyone was there looking at the stock. Oh, and I saw Margaret. She asked if we could join them for dinner next Sunday. She has news she wants to share." Rhett raised an eyebrow. "News?" Eliza's smile was secretive. "I think she wants to tell us herself, but let's just say Samuel might be joining your ranks soon." "A father," Rhett guessed, pleased for his friend and partner. "That's wonderful. They've wanted a child for so long." "It is wonderful," Eliza agreed. "And speaking of wonderful things," she reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This came for you from Denver." Rhett took the envelope, recognizing the handwriting of James Hampton, who had moved to Denver 2 years ago to expand his construction business. Breaking the seal, he scanned the contents, his expression growing increasingly pleased. "James is offering us a contract," he explained to Eliza, "for furniture for a hotel he's building in Denver. Says he can't find craftsmanship like ours anywhere else and he's willing to pay a premium." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "It's a big order, Eliza. Would mean expanding the workshop, maybe taking on an apprentice or two." "That's wonderful, Rhett," Eliza said, genuine excitement in her voice. "You and Samuel deserve this recognition. Your work is exceptional." Her pride in him, her unwavering support of his ambitions, still moved Rhett deeply. This partnership in life, in dreams, in the raising of their children, was everything he hadn't known, he was seeking during those lonely years on the trail. That evening, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Rhett and Eliza sat on their porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. This had become their ritual, this quiet time together at day's end, a chance to talk, to plan, to simply be together without the demands of work or children. "I was thinking today," Eliza said, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness, "about the first time we sat together like this at Sam's homestead." "Do you remember?" "Of course," Rhett replied, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "You told me there was a difference between surviving and living." She smiled, pleased that he recalled the conversation so clearly. "You've done more than just live these past 5 years, Rhett. You've flourished, built something meaningful." She squeezed his hand. "I'm so proud of the man you are, the father you've become, the life we've created together." Rhett brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "All because of a broken wagon and the remarkable woman I found beside it." He looked out at their land, at the home they'd built, at the future stretching before them filled with possibilities. "Best detour I ever took." Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder, a position as familiar and right as breathing. "Not a detour," she corrected softly. "A destination." As night deepened around them, Rhett Turner, once a solitary rider who measured freedom by the distance between himself and others, held his wife close and marveled at how differently he understood freedom now. It wasn't about the absence of connections, but about the right ones, the kind that strengthened rather than confined, that enriched rather than diminished. The cowboy who had ridden alone for so many years had found, at last, the journey's end he hadn't known he was seeking in a woman's love, in children's laughter, in a home built with his own hands, in a community where he belonged. In the broken wagon that had seemed like misfortune, he had found not just hope, but everything.